Hey everyone, Reaper here again. Let me just adjust this. Make sure you hear me okay. Back again with another video. Yes, this is now the first part of my video game collecting series. Let me just briefly tell you a little bit about this series. It's not going to be me showing you this is what I have for the Genesis, this is what I have for Nintendo. It's not that. It's just my history with the video games, similar to the history that I had with comic book collecting. It's just like a chronicle that I find entertaining to talk about, that I like to do, since video gaming is another hobby of mine that is still with me. I think a lot of us, when we, as we grow, we have a bunch of hobbies. And some of these hobbies or collections that we have start to go away as we get older or as we get into other things. We have other interests. Comics have been with me since 1993, but video games have been with me since officially 1988. And these are the two things that have stuck with me for all these decades. And I think in my last video I made an error when I said I bought Castlevania 19 and a half years ago or something like that. It was really 29 and a half years ago, so I apologize for that little mathematical error. But, 19 years ago, 29 years ago, it's decades, right? And it's obviously says a lot about that hobby. And I think both video gaming and comics have evolved over these years, each in their own way, to keep people interested in them, or to draw new people into them. When I was a kid, I really liked action figures. And, today I'm not really into action figures. I haven't been in such a long time. I used to collect them, but I sold a lot of those things off. So once again, that's like a hobby that really didn't transcend time with me as much as comics and video games. And that's why I did the comic book history videos, and that's why I'm doing these videos, because they're still very important to me, and I still look forward to getting more and more stuff. So my history of video games, really, I'm going to try to make some of this brief. I'm not going to go into detail, super detail, but just give a brief history. The first video game console that I was familiar with is one that my father had. It was called the ColecoVision. Now, the game that I remember him playing, I don't remember the exact title, but it was a blackjack game. And I remember he had this little animated character on the side of the screen, and, he was the dealer or whatever. And I remember if you took a hit when you weren't supposed to, he would get angry. Much like real blackjack, if you played it in Atlantic City or Las Vegas. When you're taking a hit that you're not supposed to, that pisses off other people around the table that may have needed that card. Which is why I don't play blackjack whenever I go to Atlantic City. But that's the game I remember him playing. I enjoyed watching it. And those that remember the ColecoVision, it was at the time when video games were dying in the early 80s. They were very popular for a long period of time. But then to the exact reason why the video games crashed, and I think it was in 1983 or something to that effect. I don't have the full details. There are other YouTube channels and other documentaries out there that could explain exactly why video games died out. But the ColecoVision, I remember it had one of those game pads that had a little turning knob and had numeric buttons. That's what I remember of it. So after that, I remember the Atari. I remember the kid across the street. He had the Atari, and I would go over there and watch him play Pitfall and other Atari games. And I was, was interested in this. But things didn't change for me until I think the holidays of 1987. I don't remember which one. But I remember I was over my cousin Cindy's house. Now, you'll hear her name over and over again throughout the series. And I mentioned her in a previous video. As we were leaving, me and my family were leaving the house. It was the end of the day and we were leaving. She was playing a video game. As we were leaving, the TV was right next to the door. And she was just sitting there playing this video game. And I remember watching it. And I was like, wow, this is better than the Atari that I've seen and better than anything that I was into. And I remember it looked like it was a really interesting game. And I said, what game is this? What is this? Is this the Atari? And she said, no, this is Nintendo. And I said, well, what's the game? And she said, it's Excite Bike. And I was like, wow, this game right here. Now, this wasn't my first Nintendo game, but I got it pretty early on. But this was the first Nintendo game I ever saw played, Excite Bike. And this is all the games I'm going to show you are what I've had in my collection since I started collecting. None of these have been bought. None of these have been purchased within recent years, because I don't collect Nintendo. Sometimes I'll pick up an old Nintendo game or a Super Nintendo game, but very rarely. I'm not really a Nintendo collector. I'm primarily a Sega and a Sony collector. So I'll get games that I didn't have back then now. But when I show you a Nintendo or a Super Nintendo game, or a Nintendo 64 game, or any Nintendo game, these are games that I've had since they first came out, or a year or two after they came out. So these are all this is from 1988 when I first purchased it, but I first learned of it in 87. So after we left, my father said he would get, believe it or not, he said he would get me this video game system, and it took months for him to actually make good on that promise. I never really asked him again for it. I was like, oh wow, he's going to get it for me, and it sort of just died out. But then a few months later, we went looking for it, and we finally found one. We finally found one at Sears, because it was really difficult to find. And this was spring of 1988. And some of these games I don't have, or at least I can't find the other game I wanted to show you. But these are the games I bought. When we bought the Nintendo, we bought 3 games with it. One was baseball, because that's what my father wanted to play. I have it, I just don't know where it is. A lot of my Nintendo games are packed away somewhere. Since I never really paid too much attention to Nintendo, they're packed away somewhere, and I had to dig out some of these. But this one, which came with the system, Super Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt, and Kung Fu. When my dad said I pick out a couple of games, I picked Kung Fu because I recently saw it played at the kid across the street, the one that had Atari. Well, he also had Nintendo, and he started playing Nintendo. And one of the games I saw played before I got my Nintendo was Kung Fu, and I was like, oh, this looks pretty interesting. And because I didn't know what else to pick, I didn't know. Oh, I want this game, that game. I couldn't tell you. So I just said, oh well, do they have Kung Fu? And picked up Kung Fu, and he picked up baseball, and I was quite happy with Mario Brothers, the game that came with it, because I saw the kid across the street play it. I was really into that. So that's really how I got into Nintendo. That's how I got into video games. The first video games that I've heard of, and the first games I saw, and the first games I was able to get. As I got more and more into Nintendo, with that Nintendo that we purchased, Nintendo Power was just coming out. This was 1988, and the first issue wasn't to come out, I think, until August. So my mom asked me, would you like to get this magazine? You're not going to get the first issue for a few months. I said, yeah, sure, why not? So she signed me up for it, and unfortunately, I didn't prepare that well. I didn't dig out the first issues, but I have them. I'll show them in another video. But I did get the first few issues of Nintendo Power through that subscription, with the advertisement that came with the Nintendo set. I didn't get Rob the Robot. I remember seeing Rob the Robot on TV commercials. I just got the standard deck. I don't have it here with me because, like I said, a lot of my Nintendo stuff is packed, but what I can show you is a re-release of the Nintendo that came out some years later in the early 90s. If you are looking to get a Nintendo, an old school Nintendo, not that Nintendo Mini or whatever. If you're looking to have an actual Nintendo console, I cannot recommend this one enough. This is called the Top Loader Nintendo. It runs about $100 on eBay, and it comes with a redesigned controller. Let me show you here. Remember the old controllers? They were rectangular. They looked like this, which were fine. But this new Nintendo came with what they call the dog bone controller. Now, mine is a little discolored. It's a little yellow. I think it was more gray when it first came out, but it's many, many years old. Very comfortable, and really set the standard for controller comfortability in your hand with this particular model. But yeah. Remember the old Nintendos? Those of you that remember, you put the cartridge in, and sometimes the screen would blink or the game wouldn't start up right now, and people would say that it's because of dust. No, the games did not have dust. The problem was, you see the pins in this? In the cartridge board, it has pins, and these pins have to make contact with the board inside the Nintendo. A lot of times the board inside the thing inside the Nintendo was poorly designed, and it would get stretched out, so the pins would not meet with the cartridge, and that's why it would flicker. And we all had a bunch of different ways of getting the game started, using rubbing alcohol inside the cartridge and all that stuff. But with this model, it was built better, and the pins always made contact, and the game would always start 90% of the time. So you didn't have to worry about that issue with the top-loader Nintendo, and that's why for those of you that are interested in getting into old-school Nintendo, you want to have the actual system, I would say getting this over the standard gray box that we all know. This is a much better purchase. It's $100. Sometimes you get a little bit more, sometimes you get a little bit less, depending on who's selling it, depending on where you find it. But I would say it's definitely worth the money for those of you that are retro collectors and would like to have an old school Nintendo. Before the summer, I remember seeing these other commercials for this game that I said, oh, this game looks pretty good. Now, for those of you that watched my year one comic book collecting video, you remember my uncle, we would go to Jersey City and he would get comics for me, and I went to go meet Gilbert at that comic book store. Well, before he was doing that for me, he would occasionally, because he's my mother's brother, and she would tell him, oh, I'll give you the money if you could get this game out by you, because we don't seem to have it around here. And he said, okay. And I remember he picked up the game that I wanted, and I was eagerly awaiting for it to come. And I remember he came down my street. It was maybe May of that year, so he had the window down and it was warmer out. And I saw him, and he looked at me. He said, oh, did you bring it? And he nodded. And it was this game here. The Legend of Zelda. This is the one from 1988. Like I said, all these are original from when I first got them. Came from, I think, the Hudson Mall. And I remember that summer, my cousin Cindy came over, as we would often do over the summers. I would go over to her house for a while, for about a week, and she would come over to my house for a week. That year, she came over to my house, and we played the hell out of Zelda. Mainly, it was her watching me play, trying to get the flute in level 5, for those of you that remember that. A lot of the cryptic messages in this game, because I know there were a lot of cryptic messages in order to solve puzzles, I was able to figure out. Like that one, not because, oh yeah, I'm so smart. No, it's because I just used some common sense. That one, there's a part, I forget what level it is, I think it's level 7. When you walk into it and you have this little creature that says grumble, grumble, right? And some people were so stuck because you couldn't go on with the labyrinth unless you passed him. And he would say grumble, grumble. And they had a strategy guide out, I think. Well, I remember picking up this piece of meat in the game. And I said, well, grumble, grumble. It sounds like he's hungry. So I just gave him the meat, and that was the solution to the puzzle. So I think a lot of those early Nintendo games had a lot of cryptic messages in them, and you needed strategy guides. But if you really thought about them, you could figure them out. I know I talked previously in other videos that I used cheat devices. Well, back in those days, we didn't really have cheat devices, so you had to be good at games. So over the summer, I went to hang out with my cousin Cindy's for my birthday. And, my mom says, okay, we'll go to the Hudson Mall or the Hudson Toys R Us, whatever it was we went to. I think it was the Toys R Us. And says, oh, you get a couple of games. Well, remember, Cindy came over earlier that summer where we were playing Zelda. She said she got this new game that she thought I would enjoy because I've been bragging about Zelda. It's an action-adventure game and all that stuff. And she says, oh, well, I got this game that I think you'd like. And I said, oh yeah, what is it? It's called Castlevania. You got to really try it. I'll bring it over. And she brought it over. And I enjoyed it. So when I went to her house for my birthday and we went to that store, my mom says, well, what would you like for your birthday? I said, well, she said you could pick out a couple of games. First one I picked out was Castlevania. The second one I picked out was this one, Wizards and Warriors. Another good game, but it was kind of hard. And another game I picked out, which I later regretted almost immediately, was Top Gun. I don't know what this stuff is on it. It's some old stuff. It's all original. So those are the games I got for my birthday that year. As we moved toward the holiday, this was the first holiday, one of many to come, where I was getting video games. Okay, so 1988 was the first year where I got video games for Christmas. And as the years went on, it would be a staple for me when it came to getting Christmas presents, getting games. So I'll talk a little bit about this before I go on to the next subject and end the video. I don't want to go too much in this. But yeah, before I actually get to this, though, I wanted to talk to you about something. Back in 88, 89, 90, more or less, We talk about games now. A lot of people play games. A lot of people in the YouTube comic book community play video games. They're on Xbox, they're on PlayStation. Games are, a big thing in pop culture, to both genders now, for most part. You have your mobile phones, you play games, you have your portable gaming systems, you have your computer games, simulation games, whatever. People play games, people know of games. Back then, if you played video games, you weren't necessarily, it wasn't the in thing to do. And it's the same thing with comic book collecting, I might add. I remember I used to get a lot of ridicule for playing games. Sure, there were people that had Nintendo. Sure, there were people that had other systems and played them. But it wasn't so mainstream. And when things are usually in the minority, they're usually attacked. Okay, and playing video games or talking about video games as much as I did, maybe to a fault, I admit, was the minority. And I'd faced a lot of ridicule. And I even, faced ridicule when I first started collecting comic books from family members. Those of you that could talk to your family about purchasing comic books or talk about comic books or games, yeah, you didn't get that in my family. You were ridiculed. You wouldn't dare say anything to one of my family members that you just purchased this big expensive book. You would be ostracized immediately. So that was the sort of environment that I came from. Now, my mother was always very supportive of both. She would get me the games and comics until I was old enough to get a job and buy them myself. So she never really bothered me, but you wouldn't mention these things to other people in my family, in particular my father, and even kids in the playground. Yeah, they would like, video games, that's stupid. That's baby stuff. Why are you playing with baby stuff? That was the common thing that I would hear. So I learned at an earlier age, during those days, the Nintendo days, really, that I was like pretty much in the closet. You couldn't come out, because if you came out, you were just ridiculed. So I turned inward, and I learned to keep my gaming and my comic collecting private, and that's why I typically don't talk about it with people as much as I do. I share it on YouTube. I share it with some people on YouTube, but even then I'll be a little I try to keep things to myself, so to speak, with certain things, and I that's something that's with me, but that came from video game collecting and all that stuff, being in video games. Okay, with that being said, I'm going to get back to the Christmas story. I started mentioning that, it was my first Christmas video games, and, I wanted 3 games for that Christmas, and the big games that year, Super Mario Bros. 2, which really wasn't Super Mario Bros. 2. It was actually Doki Doki Panic with a Mario theme for Western audiences. If you want to learn more about that, you could check on YouTube about the real Super Mario Bros. 2. Another big game that year was Castlevania 2, Simon's Quest. And a lot of people are familiar with the Angry Video Game Nerd, know about Simon's Quest. Another big game was Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. And of course I wanted all these games. Now I wound up not getting Castlevania 2 because we couldn't find it. It was very difficult. Back in those days, when you buy games, it's not like you go to Best Buy or you go to Toys R Us or you go to Walmart, where if you wanted the new game, most of the time, unless it's this brand new console that came out, they would have it. These days, nope. They would get a few copies in, they being these certain stores like Toys R Us, Captron, Electronics Boutique, Babbage's, Software, etc. They would only get a couple copies of, let's say, Zelda 2. And they wouldn't get any more copies for several weeks or months. And back then, you would go on a waiting list. And if they got, let's say, 10 copies on a waiting list that has 200 kids or 200 people on it, you're not getting that game for a while. So that's the way it was back then. Very difficult to get those hot games. Very difficult. And this would last for several years, up until I think the mid-90s, when it was really difficult to get those hot new games. It started getting easier in the 93, 94, 95, and now it's super easy. But back in the late 80s, early 90s, 90, 91, 89, good luck. Unless it's been out for a while, it's been out for a year, then you can get it. But if a brand new game came out, you're not getting it for a while. Consider yourself lucky. With that being said, my father took me, we were looking for these games, we couldn't find them in Toys R Us. So he took me to this place in Linden called Kitty Mart. He had a bunch of toys and games, and he had 3 games that I wanted. He had Zelda 2, he had Super Mario Bros. 2, and he had Double Dragon. And my mother said, you gotta, get all three of them. Those are that's his Christmas, and that's it. So we got there, and the guy showed they were $60 a piece back in 1988. What is that today? Games are $60 today. So he was selling these games back then for $60 a piece. Maybe he was overpricing them. I don't know. Probably. So my dad looked at them, then he looked at me, and he said, "Pick one." And I said, "One?" He said, "One." I said, "Okay." So I picked Zelda 2 because I was a big Zelda fan. But I remember looking at that Mario 2 and I was like, oh man, I really want that Mario 2. And it took several months for me to get Mario 2. I mean, this was back in, I think, October, several months, a couple months. Okay, it was right before Christmas that I was finally able to get Mario 2. And why is this colored silver? Because I'm an idiot and I colored it silver back in 1988. I was like, well, this is gold. Maybe I need a silver card. If I'm ever going to get another Nintendo card, I should get another Super Mario 2 card just to have one that's not colored, okay, silver, because it's like it's weird. But I finally got it like a week before Christmas. I got it from actually Sam Goody in Woodbridge Mall. I was on a waiting list, and one night I heard the phone ring, and I just had this feeling that it was Sam Goody, and it was. And eventually, earlier in December, my dad went to Newport City Mall and something up in North Jersey or whatever. I think that's what it was called, and they had Double Dragon. So that year, I did get those three games, but it took a while. And that's it. A couple months may not seem like a big deal to us now, but to a kid, it's an eternity because your days are longer as a kid. Today, as an adult, we have so much to do in our lives, so the days go by faster. That's why years go by faster. Well, back then, time didn't go as fast for us. Just a couple other things I want to talk about before I close up. One of the reasons why I was into comics and to games is because I feel it's a form of escapism. I mean, that's what it is, right? You're able to physically interact with another world, whether it's a video game or a comic book, that takes you out of the present world and takes you to a better place, so to speak, or a more fun place. And that's why I think these things have such an appeal to me and to probably others. It is a form of escapism. Now, some may argue that video games are violent and they may cause violence. Well, I'm not about to get into that debate. If you want to learn about that, read some psychological studies, and you decide for yourself whether these things are actually make kids and adults prone to violence. That's up to you. I've heard both sides of the story. I have my opinions, but I'm not going to get into that right now. But, it's a form of escapism. How many people used to collect CDs or compact discs? CDs or compact. I meant to say cassettes. Well, you follow your favorite bands. It's a form of escapism, right? You listen to the music. It brings you to a better place, so to speak. And it's the same thing with comics, and it's the same thing with action figures. You collect action figures, it's a form of escapism. Video games and comic books are no different. And that's why these things have such an appeal to me, and that's why I believe, generally, they have such an appeal to everyone else. But as I close this video, my friend Joe, you like Nintendo too, but I think it was in 1990, he said, oh man, I got this awesome video game system. It's called the TurboGrafx 16. This. Now, I didn't get this when this first came out. I got this back in, I think, 2000, 2001, when eBay was only a few years old, and I was buying games left and right because they were really cheap, and this was one of the things I got. I got this, a couple of controllers, the multi-tap, and a couple of games for, I think, for $50. Maybe you could still get it for $50 now. I don't know. I haven't been in the market for a TurboGrafx 16 in, almost 20 years. But he got this. This is what it looks like. Okay. He's like, oh, this game's great. You got to come. This system's great. You got to come over and play. I'm like, oh, okay. He's like, I heard of the TurboGrafx 16. It sounded pretty cool. And I'll just show you a couple of the games. He had Bonk's Adventure. Now, I don't have the box as the original box they came in. I just have the jewels. He had this really cool game called Bloody Wolf. and he had this game called Splatterhouse. So let me just show you these things for a moment, how they're different. You saw the Nintendo carts. Well, these were on something called Hue cards, right? Came in a little sleeve. These things were, in my opinion, were way better than Nintendo carts. Every time you put it in the TurboGrafx 16, which goes into this slot right here. I know you're not getting a great view of this, but goes in, you put the power on, and the game starts. Never had a problem. Novel idea, right? Nintendo needed to take a lesson into that. Well, I guess they did when they released the top loader. But yeah, that's what these things were. All the information was on this little part right here, and the rest of it was just a plastic card, like a credit card. Awesome. I would have loved to have seen these with Nintendo, but whatever. But yeah, man, these games are great. It's called the TurboGrafx 16. It truly didn't have 16-bit graphics, but it was pretty much Nintendo, but a little bit better than Nintendo. But I thought the TurboGrafx game was great, but I couldn't get it. I had the Nintendo. I was a Nintendo fan, you know. But Joe really enjoyed it. So anyway, one day me and Joe were talking in lunchroom, and I'm about to close this video. I know it's been almost a half hour. Thank you all for sitting through it. But me and Joe were talking in lunchroom, and we were talking about, well, I think Nintendo's a little bit better here. He's like, nah, I think TurboGrafx 16's a little better, and blah, blah, blah. You know, having that little console war argument. And this one guy's just looking at us, right? He's looking at us, and he says, nah, man, you both got it wrong. The Nintendo's cool. The TurboGrafx 16 seems like it's okay, but they're not the best system out there. So me and my friend Joe, we were like, oh yeah? What else is out there? We didn't know what the hell else was out there. You know, we had no idea other than I didn't even know the TurboGrafx 16, what that was, until Joe said something. We didn't really see commercials for it. It wasn't really advertised too well here in the States. That's why it became a flop. But he said, no, I have the best system. And I said, what system is that? He said, the Sega Genesis. Thank you for watching. Part 2 will cover the console war and Sega Genesis and beyond. Thank you for sitting through this video. I appreciate your comments. I appreciate you watching. I know this is not a typical video that comic book, people that watch comic book channels watch. But those of you that stuck with me, I thank you. Tune in next year for part 2, the console wars. Take care.